Hello, my name is Aidan Rupert, alongside me, Rob Murray, and welcome to episode 8 of the WCHC Sports Podcast, where we discuss the latest news and updates from around the sports world. We like sports, and you should too. Be sure to subscribe to our WCHC Sports 88.1 FM YouTube page, where Rob and I will be posting our takes on the sports world each and every week. Today, we'll be discussing the NCAA's plan to kick off the basketball season November 25th, a flurry of injuries week 2 of the NFL season, the Boston Celtics' comeback hopes against the Miami Heat, and the Dallas Stars' prospects of closing things out in a Stanley Cup final. But first, Rob, I got to ask, how about them Clippers?
And the Clippers are simply just further proof that everything I touch turns to you-know-what. They were my championship pick at the start of the bubble and clearly let me down in more ways than one. However, I don't think I'm alone in saying how genuinely shocked I was that this was the outcome and that the Clippers once again failed to get past the second round. My gut feeling was that these guys were talented enough to find a way no matter how much Denver ended up throwing at them. And yes, I know playoff exits early on have sort of been the status quo for the Clippers for the past decade, but this was easily their most talented roster that they've had. And they've had some pretty good teams in the past. The biggest one coming to mind is obviously Chris Paul and Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, the Lob City Clippers of, the early 2010s. And while I don't see too many reasons to shake up the roster, I still think this team is very good and has a championship window of at least a few more years. A few moves, both on the floor and on the coaching staff, could do some good towards next season. And that, of course, being Paul George actually shows up next season as well.
Yeah, Paul George was something else for sure. Suddenly we saw playoff P shift gears into pandemic P. And it was unfortunate because, eventually you're watching a game and you just genuinely start feeling bad for a guy who can't hit shots. But then you remember he called himself Playoff P. And then after the series was over, this is what got me. He said it wasn't championship or bust this season for the Clippers. If this isn't championship or bust, what is? I guess he's referring to next season and the fact that they hope to have their core back for at least another run. But come on, they were my pick to win the championship, I'm pretty sure. I definitely had them going to the finals against Milwaukee, who obviously we already talked about. But yeah, so playoff P, we will see you next year alongside your buddy, Fun Guy. But before we get into the games from this week themselves, shout out to you, the listener, for your support of WCHC Sports on Instagram. Over the past week, our Instagram following has increased exponentially, and we are just getting started. Stay tuned to WCHC_sports on Instagram, as well as our Twitter and Facebook accounts for updates on the podcast, as well as Holy Cross Athletics. So, Rob, you and I, even as college students, we have not had a chance in several weeks now to really talk too much about the NCAA. And we actually got some big news in the world of NCAA basketball this past week in that on Wednesday, the NCAA, they set November 25th as their hopeful start date for the 2020-2021 season. And this, of course, is contingent upon the availability of widespread and rigorous testing for COVID-19. But it is nonetheless a positive development in that teams have been practicing for a couple of weeks now at the very least. I know Holy Cross men's team and women's team, they've been going after it, and I've seen some great workout videos of them doing some socially distanced drills, wearing the masks, but really giving it their all and staying ready. So what were your thoughts on the announcement from the NCAA this past week?
Well, I was certainly excited, Aidan, and this comes on the heels of the Big Ten announcing that they're actually going to resume playing their football season sometime in late October. The consensus was early on that the Big Ten was not going to play football and keep, namely, Ohio State out of the championship conversation. But arguably the best conference in college football is back, and I think part of that decision gave way to the NCAA releasing their plan to open up the season as well.
Yeah, Rob, it's definitely a positive development for all conferences involved. And I was just watching some highlights actually of college football after Heat Celtics last night. And, a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on this. Should they be playing? Shouldn't they be playing? But frankly, I think it's best just at the end of the day to be happy for the players themselves and obviously the coaches, the fans as well. But as a college athlete, you only have so many years, right? That's not to say that professional athletes don't have a short window themselves, but college athletics, it's a dream of so many. And to be robbed of a season potentially, it would definitely be a lifelong blow to some of these wonderful men and women we see in sports. But going back to NCAA basketball, November 25th as a start date is interesting. It is about 2 weeks later than teams usually start, or at least where they've started over the past couple of decades. So you would think that that's only subtracting 4, maybe 5 games from their schedules. But there is this additional part of the announcement that teams will only be playing a maximum of 25 to 27 games during their season, and there will be a particular emphasis on in-conference play, with each team participating in only a handful of out-of-conference matchups. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way they structured all of this. It was the NCAA Senior Vice President of Basketball, Dan Gavitt, who said that the NCAA, talking about when we get to February, March, they may actually award tournament bids based on regular season conference champions rather than hold conference tournaments as we are accustomed to seeing for just about every conference now. And that's not yet confirmed. It's sort of speculative at this point in terms of how they're going to structure this. But definitely my takeaway from that is they are focused more than anything on holding an NCAA tournament, making March Madness have its triumphant return. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people talk about the NCAA and how they're after their money. And yeah, certainly there's something to that. But at the same time, just about 75% of the NCAA's revenue comes from March Madness alone, or so I've read. And that's for the NCAA, not just NCAA men's basketball or women's basketball. That's it as a governing body. And so right now their plan is to play with 68 teams at 14 different venues. We'll see if that materializes, but I think you and I can certainly agree that March Madness would be such a positive spin if we can end up getting to that point.
For sure. March Madness is easily one of the most remarkable sports spectacles that the United States has to offer. And, going back to your point on the fact that conference play will be the main focus of the NCAA season, I think the NCAA basketball commission that threw this together took a lot of inspiration from Major League Baseball and their structuring of the regular season, given that you're seeing teams from, for example, the NL and AL Central exclusively playing one another and not even touching teams from the West or the East. So I think going forward, that's going to be what most sports leagues aim to do, with the exception of the NFL, who, by the way, have been pretty successful so far in their containment of COVID-19. They had very positive test results, and not, in the bad sense. But, they were very low on cases to start the first 2 weeks of the season. And like you said, the NCAA, March Madness is their moneymaker, and I'm sure they'll do everything they can to bring that tournament into play. And if they follow the correct health protocols and do the things that these other professional sports leagues have been implementing to a great degree of success, I'm confident that we'll have, one of the best tournaments in American sports back in 2021.
Yeah, Rob, it was definitely I definitely have plenty of credit to give to the NFL for the way they've handled things, because as someone who had my doubts about whether the NBA and WNBA could succeed in a bubble format, I obviously had so many doubts about the MLB and NFL's ability to execute in keeping players safe. But yeah, really, it's a similar situation that the NCAA will ultimately have to deal with. And those are just the logistical difficulties that exist of the NCAA being a governing body for an organization that spans the entirety of this country, right? So different regions obviously are going to face extremely different challenges in handling COVID-19 over the next several months, just in terms of, what the caseload looks like in any given place at any given time. And so it definitely has to be a difficult thing for them to deal with. Obviously, so many teams and conferences, they look for guidance from the top down, but really also it's going to be a case-by-case basis, no pun intended, obviously. And it's a bit of a dark joke, but just in terms of what this is going to end up looking like for each team. And we don't know, quite frankly, what the Patriot League has in store. So we don't know what it means for Holy Cross or the Patriot League. You would obviously assume that with the players still going through these workouts that they are hoping to tip off themselves November 25th. But we've also seen in the past the Patriot League look to leagues such as the Ivy League for a precedent to follow in terms of how they're going to handle these situations. And the Ivy League, as well as the Pac-12 conference, they've already ruled out winter sports until 2021, if I'm not mistaken. So definitely fingers crossed, as I'm really looking forward to watching Holy Cross basketball among other sports this winter. But, props to the NCAA for taking a step, hopefully in the right direction, and we will continue to monitor the story for sure.
I, for one, can't wait to see the Crusaders back in play. And you mentioned different barriers that conferences and sports in general will have to face on a state-by-state basis. But I think the main thing that any conference or sport needs to ensure is that, A, their protocols are well structured and are put in place to where that, if they need to respond to an outbreak, they're well equipped to do so. And B, the players and the coaches are on board with the idea that they need to follow a strict set of rules if they want to not only protect others, but have, a full and exciting season. So if the NCAA is able to check off those two boxes like the NFL and the NBA and the NHL have, I have no doubt we'll see sports again. And that will certainly put a smile on both of our faces, that I am sure of. But before we get into the NFL next, do you ever feel that sports, rather than mitochondria, are the powerhouses of the cell? Do your friends ever complain that all you talk about is sports? Most importantly, are you ready to see Jahiva Floyd make an NBA roster next year? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, WCHC Sports has a place for you. For information on opportunities to broadcast, podcast, and everything in between, email wchcsports@g.holycross.edu today.
Well, Rob, for anyone who partakes in fantasy football, much less professional football in the NFL, it was an absolutely brutal week for injuries in the NFL, and it's really unlike any we've seen in quite some time. Today, I don't know if you caught these stories, but you had players like Odell Beckham, as well as Michael Thomas, who is injured himself, literally tweeting out midday their prayers to the league as well as its players for just all of the significant injuries that piled up over the last 12 hours alone. It's sort of a situation of where do you start? And obviously probably the most notable is the Giants. Right now they fear that their star running back, Saquon Barkley, has suffered a torn ACL. That's not yet confirmed, but it seems to be all indications from the past several hours that that is indeed the case. I know he had an emotional response to that on social media, so he's probably not feeling too great about his prospects as well. And then in other games, you had the 49ers today. They just got absolutely torn apart. There was Nick Bosa. He also is in the same boat as Saquon. He thinks that he may have suffered a torn ACL himself. And that wasn't it for the 49ers. You had their QB, Jimmy Garoppolo, with the ankle injury, and running back Raheem Mostert with not an ACL, but an MCL. So both of those two guys, they're probably going to miss a few weeks, but it was sort of just emblematic of the day as a whole, as so many teams just ended up having to put in some of their second string guys just to stay on the field, right? So I don't know. What was your least favorite thing of watching on the injury front today, Rob?
Yeah, man, I feel terrible for the 49ers. You lose really three cornerstones of that team that got you to the Super Bowl in 2019. You have Bosa, the cornerstone pass rusher on that defense. You have Garoppolo, the leader of that team and the offense, and then Mostert, who was a key contributor to that Super Bowl run for the Niners. All three of them are expected to miss considerable time. And for a team like the Niners, as deep as they are, being thin at all three of those positions is certainly going to hurt their prospects in what is a loaded NFC West. You have the Rams, Cardinals, and Seahawks, their division rivals, all at 2-0, exiting week 2. And the road's only going to get harder for San Francisco. So, prayers up to all those players who suffered injuries today. I think a lot of people are going to blame today's slew of injuries and honestly the slew of injuries that may follow in the next few weeks to the shortened season and the shortened training camp, as well as the elimination of the preseason in response to COVID-19. And Aidan, you and I were talking about this before recording. We both think there's certainly some merit to that argument. Preseason and training camps, while seemingly inconsequential to the majority of fans of the NFL, it's arguably the most important time of the year for NFL teams, as it allows players to properly condition themselves for a grueling 16-game season at minimum for non-playoff teams. And it also allows them to get acclimated to the playbook. I think the lack of preparation among all teams, given COVID-19, has led to sort of an offensive explosion early on in the year. Last week, we saw 87 touchdowns in week 1, which was the most in week 1 history of the NFL. And you're seeing similar parallels in baseball, where a lot of pitchers specifically are either getting hurt or underperforming as a result of limited spring training and conditioning of their arms. I don't know how many 20-run games we've seen so far this year, and they're only playing 60 games. You had the Atlanta Braves score 29 runs against the Marlins. A few weeks back, you've had the Yankees either score or approach 21 runs multiple times this season. So, if there was ever a season to shed light on the fact that preparation is key and injuries can be so detrimental to a team's momentum and success, it's 2020, no doubt.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, Rob, going back to the 87 touchdowns that we saw in week 1. That sort of goes to show you that obviously it's tremendously detrimental to the players from a physical standpoint. I agree with you in that training camp as well as preseason, they're absolutely vital in physical preparation for a grueling 16 or more game season. But I think the 87 touchdowns show you that it's also psychological. I think that, obviously NFL defenders, they have their work cut out for them. It is tough to be on the lines in the NFL. But you wonder if week 1 sort of showed us that these players weren't quite ready to put their bodies on the line for their teams or to, put the hardest hits out on players. Because 87 touchdowns in week 1, again, I simply can't comprehend that as an accident. And just one more note on the injuries, it's especially demoralizing this year where you had teams really have to rush into their seasons so quickly with a shortened training camp and elimination of the preseason. You talk about the team like the New York Giants that were essentially built for Saquon Barkley, right? Like you talk about their roster construction, they were really depending on having him available. And the best ability, as the adage goes, is availability. And just a couple of weeks after you had training camp going on, it's all gone, right? Their season is really washed in a lot of ways for all intents and purposes. So you have to look to your second string guys to bounce back and fill in these positional gaps, but nobody can quite do it like these stars that we saw go down today. And really, you commend the NFL on the one hand for sticking to their guns and being willing and able to give the players and the fans the season that they had so hoped for. but you also have to wonder, what's this going to do to the teams right now? And just as important, what do some of these injuries mean for the career success of some of these players in the future, their ability to be rewarded with big contracts? It's a tough day for the NFL. We saw some exciting football, but really just a tough day to be a fan or a player.
Absolutely. And as a fan, as much as you want to see your team win, that is always going to come secondary to the health and well-being of a player and his ability to, keep himself healthy and being able to make money to support his family. But I think all these injuries, especially to star players like Barkley and Bosa today, really challenge our notion as a society that we hold that, athletes are kind of these superhuman heroes that, define basic human laws day in and day out. And while that may be true sometimes, they're just like us. They need to prepare for the things they need to do. They need to put the effort in. They need to condition their bodies and minds to be ready for game day. And the lack of preparation as a result of COVID-19 has sort of made them vulnerable in this sense. And, you hope this trend of injuries doesn't continue weeks into the season, because that would obviously be a terrible thing to see. But moving on from kind of the dark point in week 2 of the NFL, we had some fantastic games happen this Sunday. Earlier today, we saw the Atlanta Falcons lose 40-39 after being up 20-0 and 39-20 on the Dallas Cowboys. And I'm going to be honest, if any Atlanta Falcons fans are listening out there, and I'm sure there aren't, but if one happens to slip through the cracks, I'm sorry, because that team cannot hold the lead to save their lives. Dallas scores a touchdown, recovers an onside kick, and kicks a game-winning field goal in a matter of 2 minutes to squeak out a win. And one stat that just adds insult to injury to the Falcons, and I try not to be too mean when I say this, but teams that scored at least 39 points and had no turnovers were 441-0 coming into today's contest. So Atlanta, you just erased 441 games of protecting leads like that. I'm sorry for anyone out there that is an Atlanta Falcons fan.
It's okay. We don't have many, right?
We don't. Hopefully I'm not striking a chord with anyone, but if I am, my deepest condolences to you. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Chiefs celebrated their own game-winning field goal today. It was a 58-yarder from Harrison Butker to defeat the little brother LA Chargers 23-20 in overtime. The Chargers did put up a hell of a fight. Their first-round pick, Justin Herbert, came into the game for the relief of another injured player, Tyrod Taylor, who had to be sent to the hospital before the game due to shortness of breath. So, hopefully he is okay and ready for week 3. And another fact here for you, Aidan, had the Chiefs lost today, it would have marked the first time in Patrick Mahomes' career as a starter where his team was not leading the division. The Chiefs would have fallen to 1-1 in 2020, and the Chargers would have gone on to improve to 2-0. So, I'm trying to think when he entered the league. This is almost 2 seasons now, or slowly approaching 2 seasons, where Patrick Mahomes has been at the top of the AFC West. So just another testament to his greatness. And the final matchup we'll look into today is the Seahawks and the Patriots on Sunday Night Football. Cam Newton getting stuffed at the goal line as time expires as the Seahawks defeat the Patriots 35-30. I think flat out this was a potential MVP showcase. Russell Wilson threw 5 touchdowns. Cam Newton proved he is the player of old that you saw dominate with the Carolina Panthers. And if I'm a Patriots fan, I know there are a lot of them at Holy Cross. I'm really excited for this offense and Cam's ability to move the team down the field. I know a lot of people were writing off the Pats early on. I know people were pointing towards the Bills as the unanimous division favorite, but I certainly don't think it's clear-cut like that anymore. It's going to be a really fun division race, something we haven't gotten to experience a whole lot the past 2 decades, given that the Patriots just dominated teams left and right in that division.
Yeah, no, there are definitely a lot of Patriot fans hurting right now. I mean, I agree with you on that. There was a lot on this game, even though it's only week 2. You know, you have the primetime Sunday night football. You know, it's sort of that game that's going to really set your mood for the next few days going into the school week or the work week, whatever the case may be. But yeah, I think you're right. We had a nice talk about Cam Newton just a week or 2 ago, and we were wondering, is this for real after all he had gone through, you know, being, quote, unemployed for a month or so there. And really, it seems like he found a home in New England. And by all indications, his teammates are really loving having him on board. And even though he did get stuffed at the goal line down the stretch there, I think it's nothing but a positive development in terms of what he can do for that organization this season and beyond. So definitely Cam Newton and the Patriots worth keeping an eye on regardless.
Yeah, I think the hype is certainly real for Cam and the Pats after these first 2 games. You know, some other surprises through, the first couple contests in the NFL. You have your usual suspects at 2-0, the Chiefs, Ravens, Packers, Bills, Seahawks, Titans, all teams that made the postseason last year, having their own strong starts. But you see some surprise teams at 2-0, like the Bears, the Rams, Steelers, and Cardinals, who weren't playoff teams last year and were arguably a piece or 2 away from becoming contender. And they certainly seem to be proving that narrative with their own 2-0 starts. Teams that start 2-0, going back to 2007, make the playoffs 55% of the time. So, you know, I know their friends that they're saying, you know, who are 0-2 and 1-1, you know, it's the start of the season. We'll turn it around. In the NFL, where there's only 16 games, literally every game matters. And, you know, that's certainly something to consider, especially for teams that are 0-2, like the Texans, Eagles, and Vikings. Those 3 guys were playoff teams last year. They have just a 12% chance of making the postseason if history holds true, dating back to 2007, of course. But I feel like every year we get to see a few teams kind of move in and out of the playoff picture, and 2020 is no different, despite all the challenges COVID has presented.
That's true, Rob, and I will have you and the listeners know I am 2-0 in my sole fantasy football league. So if I have a chance to make a big deal out of that, you know, dating back to 2007, I have a great chance at the playoffs, which I guess everyone makes, right? But hey, I'm all for it.
Hey, I want to hear weekly updates from that fantasy team.
Oh, I got
but,
you.
You know, we'll move away from the NFL. We'll go towards your bread and butter here in the NBA. Tell me about quickly before we get into the other series, Denver moving on against the Clippers and being down 2-0 against the Lakers.
Yeah, so obviously we talked about at the top a little bit of Denver, Los Angeles Clippers and what that looks like, and it's not what we necessarily thought we were going to get, but at the same time we love it. Like, we love the fact that the Clippers have in many ways taken on this sort of arch villain role within the NBA. A lot of people love Kawhi Leonard. Some people love Paul George, but not a lot of people are fans of the Pat Beverleys, the Marcus Morrises of the world, so on and so forth. So for them to take on this arch nemesis sort of role, it is in a lot of ways unfair. And we talked about last week how it was a brand new group that frankly needed a little bit more time to mesh together, and the clock just ran out on them. But it was also sort of a feel-good story for Denver. It was the first time in NBA history that a team has recovered from 2 3-1 deficits in a single postseason. And so I know you have your own thoughts on the current series going on between the Lakers and the Nuggets. And I think I'm with you, Rob. I don't think that they have much of a chance at bouncing back from the 2-0 deficit, even though game 2, just an hour ago or so, came down to a remarkable game winner from Anthony Davis playing in his first conference finals. But I think we have seen that if anyone is truly at their best with their backs against the wall, it is these Denver Nuggets led by Murray and Jokic. So, yeah, but how about that shot from AD?
Fantastic. From the way he released it and was watching it into the cup, he had no doubt. That shot from the wing is his, albeit it was a little farther than where he usually takes it, but knocked it down, won the game for the Lakers. As much as I want to attest to what you said about the Nuggets being an incredibly resilient team, coming back from 2-3-1 deficits, the Lakers are the hardest team they're going to face this entire postseason. And I just think Davis's shot marked the unofficial end to Denver's season. Tying the series at 1 as opposed to going down 2-0 would have changed the entire dynamic of this Denver-LA series. And instead, Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic now have to respond to just a brutal loss and avoid going down 3-0. I think this was their best shot at making it a series. I really don't think they'll get the opportunity again to steal a game like that and tie the series against the Lakers. They're going to be playing with their backs against the ball the rest of the way. And it's sad because I think the Nuggets were the team and currently are the team that everyone's kind of rooting for. I have friends who aren't even that much of fans of the NBA who would love to see the Nuggets upset the Lakers and move on to the finals and maybe meet the Miami Heat, another, upstart sort of dark horse team that you didn't really see getting this far at the start of the postseason. But at the end of the day, I just think it's too little too late for the Nuggets. This shot was the dagger.
Yeah, I'm with you. But at the same time, anything is possible. And regardless, it definitely was a really great season for the Nuggets. They did exceed expectations. And unlike the Los Angeles Clippers, whom they beat in the last round, they didn't have much to lose. Obviously, they found some playoff success in their first appearance as a core group last year. They pushed the Trailblazers to 7 games in the second round, and ultimately they made it further this year than last. So you have to chalk that up as a success regardless of what happens in this series. But I guess moving on to the Eastern Conference, before we get into Celtics Heat, which was at one point another series at 2-0, we got the news just yesterday or the day before that Giannis Antetokounmpo has won back-to-back MVP awards, becoming also just the first forward ever to win the MVP and Defensive Player of the Year in the same season. Michael Jordan did so as a guard and Hakeem Olajuwon obviously as a center. And so he obviously accepted the award with a lot of grace. I watched a bit of his speech. He was obviously tremendously thankful to the Bucks organization, his family, his teammates, the fans. And really the part, though, that I liked the most about it was he said, in essence, don't call me MVP until I win a ring. And I think that definitely does go to show just how hungry Giannis is. I think that he's an emotional guy that obviously it's going to sting him more than most to have lost this season, especially, I think they would have lost the series had he not been injured, but the injury certainly played a part. So it was a cruel ending for Giannis in what was really a remarkable campaign. And that's what I want to ask you about. Giannis is definitely catching a lot of backlash right now. And sort of what I'm picking up on is what we're seeing in terms of the narrative on Giannis is eerily similar to that we saw just 10 years ago with LeBron James. And some fans have actually been very keen in pointing out uncanny similarities between the timeline of the two MVPs. LeBron was born, 1984, I believe, and Giannis 10 years later, 1994. LeBron drafted 2003, Giannis, meanwhile, in 2013. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, LeBron won MVPs 2009, 2010, Giannis 2019, 2020, and even down to the, being bounced in the Eastern Conference semifinals following your second MVP season. I know it's getting a little ridiculous here, but the similarities are indeed uncanny. And I just want to get your take on, is it too soon for all of the flack that Giannis is catching right now? Not to say that LeBron didn't get his fair share back in his first stint with Cleveland, but what are your thoughts on everything that's coming down on the Greek Freak right now?
Yeah, I think LeBron faced a lot more criticism at this stage in his respective career simply because he had the expectation of being great going back to when he was in high school. Even though his Cavs teams were notoriously thin, and I think there have been a lot of NBA memes centered around who exactly he played with, whether they were garbage men or plumbers or whoever they were. I do think Giannis has demonstrated the mindset of a champion, and I think that's more important than anything you can do on the court physically. If the desire is there, it'll ultimately translate, and you've seen it with guys like Michael Jordan and LeBron James, who have gone on to be all-time greats. Not saying that Giannis will reach their level or even can, if I'm being completely honest. I think he's supremely talented, but Jordan and LeBron are just, I hate to say this, but they're built different. They really are. I know that term is used over and over again. But if Giannis wants to win, he needs help. And when teams get the opportunity to get 5 to 6 looks at him in the span of 10, 11 days, instead of, coming off a back-to-back and then having to travel to Milwaukee and play him, on short rest and short preparation, it's night and day. He's far easier to game plan against when you get multiple looks at him. The offensive efficiency of not only Giannis, but the entire Bucks team takes a huge hit when kind of teams are able to focus their efforts on the Bucks and the Bucks only. You think of Toronto and Miami this year as the most obvious examples, but even the Orlando Magic forced the Bucks to sweat a little bit in that first round series. So, as I alluded to, the legends of the game earlier on, for the vast majority of them, like LeBron and Jordan, they also needed a star to get over the hump. Jordan didn't really win until Scottie Pippen came along. LeBron won his first ring when he had Dwayne Wade by his side. So if Giannis either gets someone to come to Milwaukee or he ends up going somewhere else, who knows what that'll end up like. I think I can see a title in his future, given he has, the right teammates, and given that he keeps his, Mamba championship mentality going forward.
Yeah, Rob, I think that, well, first and foremost, some of LeBron's former Cleveland teammates, the likes of Mo Williams and Anderson Varejao, are absolutely fuming right now, having been called plumbers by none other than yourself, Rob. But I have to push back and say, you made the point that Giannis needs help. And I think that you can make that argument. But at the same time, you look at the 2020 Bucks and compare them to the 2007 Cleveland Cavaliers team that made the NBA Finals. Obviously, they weren't plumbers, but that was a really, really weak roster. And we saw that they got swept by the San Antonio Spurs back then. But come on, like Chris Middleton, he is a legit player. He had a couple of bad games these playoffs, but he came up big, especially when Giannis was out. Brook Lopez has absolutely reinvented himself at this stage of his career. He is an all-defensive threat who is lights out from three, though can be streaky at times. And I think that in terms of getting him more help, we've actually seen a pretty interesting report that one of his preferred free agents or trade targets for this summer is actually going to be Chris Paul of the Oklahoma City Thunder. I think that the deal would somehow be structured around Eric Bledsoe, who has been known to underperform in the playoffs. But yeah, you look at trading your guy Bledsoe, and obviously it's going to take a little bit more than Bledsoe to land Chris Paul, even in terms of just making the salaries match. But it is tough. Like, is an aging point guard the answer? And I know that's the dumbest thing I can possibly say about a player that just made second team All NBA. But if you look at Giannis and whether or not he truly is willing to stick around and build a contender for the long run in Milwaukee, you just wonder if the help is going to come from Chris Paul or if it's going to come from the continued development of your players like Dante DiVincenzo, Pat Connaughton. Granted, those two aren't enough, obviously, but alongside the likes of Chris Middleton, you just sort of wonder what it's going to end up looking like for Milwaukee.
Yeah, I do think the East has sort of regained a little bit of the competitiveness it didn't have back when LeBron was completely running the East with the Plumber Cavs. You didn't see much competition in that conference for a long time, not trying to take away anything from LeBron's, I think it was 9 straight NBA Finals appearances, something ridiculous like that. So I do think the challenge of winning the East has gotten a little bit harder from a team standpoint, but you make a good point. I mean, I think Chris Middleton has certainly proved he can, anchor a team in scoring alongside the presence of another star. But I think just the way the Bucks play and the way they're structured, development just might not be the most timely response to the last 2 postseason failures. I think this team's gotten a lot of experience under their belt and have had a lot of opportunities to make some really deep postseason runs, and it just hasn't happened. So whether, a coaching change is needed or, a little roster shakeup is required, I do think the Bucks need to treat this situation and make, the most proactive decisions they can in building a championship team, because a talent like Giannis comes around once in a lifetime, and to squander the opportunity by not really making moves and sitting on their hands would be a huge mistake. And I think the East is and will continue to be a prime opportunity for Giannis to get to the finals and win a championship. He just needs a little more supporting help, and I think he needs to develop his outside game a little more too.
Yeah, to be fair, Rob, I think that your point on player development potentially not being the answer is spot on. I know I just pointed that out, but again, to be fair, I was sort of reaching in looking for names as potential candidates, right? I think Dante DiVincenzo, he's legit. He's going to be around this league for a long time. But Pat Connaughton, come on, like he's solid, but he's not going to be an all-star. And yeah, you start talking about the DJ Wilsons of the world. They're good. They're good role players, and I think they can contribute, but no, they're not the stars you're looking for. So the Bucks are one of the older teams in the NBA. You just had Marvin Williams retire in his late 30s. Kyle Korver, he's ancient, right? So I think you have to find a balance somewhere in between win now and keeping an eye on the future. And on that note, 2 teams who are both built for the future and looking to win right this second, we have in the Eastern Conference Finals the Boston Celtics versus the 5 seed Miami Heat. And I've been wanting all week to talk about this series. I shouldn't say that, because when it was 2-0 Miami, I had no particular desire to talk about the series. But yeah, let's break it down really quick. Obviously, can't spend too much time on it, but in talking about Celtics Heat, here is my main takeaway. The biggest storyline has not been Jimmy Butler, Jason Tatum, Kemba Walker, or any star player for that matter. Unexpectedly, the zone defense has emerged as the series' biggest storyline, as the Heat absolutely stifled Boston through the second half of the first 2 games by turning to their zone defense. And Rob, last week you and I talked a little bit about the zone defense and the box and one that Toronto was throwing at Boston during the last round. And just to put this into context, right? The Heat played during the regular season more than twice as much zone defense as the number 2 team, the Raptors, and of course the number 3 team, the Celtics as well. More than twice as much. So you start talking about the zone defense, or rather it's often talked about as a gimmicky defense, and that's not quite what we're seeing from Miami. I think that's one of the things that I most underestimated coming into the series, that it's really not a gimmick for them. It's what they're accustomed to and what they have practiced working on. And let's not forget that in terms of actually playing a zone defense, again, Boston struggled with it when Toronto threw it at them last series. But in terms of playing that defense and the personnel you have as a team, Goran Dragic and Duncan Robinson as defenders, they offer a lot more length than Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet in your backcourt, who are two extremely small guards, right? So I think, yeah, on my part, I frankly underestimated Miami's ability and really their innovativeness to turn to the zone defense. And, we'll talk a little bit more later on about how exactly Boston has and can crack that zone defense. But yeah, what are your thoughts on Miami's versatility here?
It's been very impressive, and I think they've continued to do what they've done the entire postseason, is play above their talent level, rise to their competition. And another point I'd like to make is you see people during the series obviously talk about, how versatile Miami is on both ends of the floor, how deep their roster is, how well Bam and Jimmy and Goran Dragic and Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson play together. But it's easy to forget contribution and, like you said, the implementation of the zone by Coach Eric Spoelstra, who not only in this season, but for the entirety of his career as head coach of the Miami Heat, really elevated this franchise to a place that not many people had expected. It is the 5th conference finals appearance for him. He's a 2-time NBA champion, but I think this year, in bringing a team to the conference finals that was not the consensus favorite with a prime LeBron James, is the most impressive feat of his career. He went through one of the best regular season teams of all time in terms of offensive and defensive efficiency. He's taken a really bright, young, talented Celtics team and sits only 2 games away from the NBA Finals. So, as much as the Heat are putting it together on the court, you got to give credit to the guy on the sideline, Eric Spoelstra, who has made it very clear that you need a good coach to succeed in the NBA and put together a really solid game plan.
Yeah, and hey, even as a Celtics fan, I have no problem with Coach Spo, right? Like, it's nothing but respect. Talk about a guy like Udonis Haslem and how long he's been a part of that Miami Heat roster. Believe it or not, Spoelstra's been around longer. He spent several years as an assistant coach in Miami before landing the head coaching job in 2008. But yeah, Spoelstra's been there 20 years now. So that's a guy that's going to garner a lot of respect, whether it's coming from your veterans like Jimmy Butler and Goran Dragic, or your young up-and-coming players like Bam Adebayo, Tyler Hero, among others, right? So, yeah, quite frankly, I have admired what he's done this series, and I do think that I would be rooting for the Miami Heat should they advance to the NBA Finals, no matter their opponent. It's been a really nerve-wracking series for me to watch, obviously as an invested Celtics fan, but it has been a fun one other than watching the Celtics blow significant leads. But that said, let's talk just a little bit more about what the Celtics can do to not blow these leads, as we saw in the first 2 games. The first 3 games, actually, they just barely snuck out of Game 3 alive. But in my mind, and this might surprise some people, I think that Gordon Hayward and his availability won the Celtics Game 3, even though he didn't play great as an individual. I don't think he even reached double figures scoring-wise, but here's why. And I had a feeling this might be the case coming into the game, and I'm so glad he was able to get that ankle rested enough to play. What it's really done is Miami, and I think Spoelstra realizes this, they struggle to get away with playing the zone defense when Gordon Hayward's on the floor, just because of what Hayward's strengths are as an individual player. Hayward is a guy that, he'll catch the ball at the 3-point line, and he doesn't have the explosiveness necessarily to get all the way to the rim and throw one down like he did that one All-Star year in Utah. But he's a guy that's catch, one dribble to the middle of the floor, and that's the key, because that is where the Celtics need to attack this zone defense from. And Gordon Hayward, in terms of his sheer decision-making ability from that spot around the foul line in the middle of the floor, it's unlike anyone the Celtics have on their roster, and it's unlike nearly anyone in the entire NBA. And I'm not saying Gordon Hayward is the best player in the NBA, but in terms of a situation that we're seeing right now, what the Celtics have been doing is Marcus Smart is often the player they plant at the foul line to catch and turn to the hoop. And Marcus Smart, he's a good facilitator, and he's developed into an adequate three-point shooter. But I would absolutely hate it if I'm Brad Stevens seeing Marcus Smart catch the ball at the foul line, turn around, take a contested mid-range jump shot. That's just not going to win you games. But Gordon Hayward, on the other hand, he's an absolutely outstanding mid-range jump shooter and playmaker. And again, Miami is straight up not playing zone defense when Hayward enters the lineup or when he goes onto the floor. You see them revert back into their man-to-man defense, which also they deserve credit for. Extremely stifling, nearly impossible to score on. But when Miami went on, I think it was something like a 60-35 run against the Celtics game 2, you best believe it was zone defense. And so it's been amusing, but also very telling that as soon as Hayward stepped off the bench game 3, they were no longer in that zone defense. And the Celtics took advantage by going small, and they, on their part, were able to switch everything defensively. And I know this is probably like a little too much basketball, like a little too in-depth, but this is just what I'm seeing out there. And it's crazy to say as a Celtics fan or as a follower of basketball that Gordon Hayward is the Celtics' only shot at winning this series. But that's just how I feel.
No, I think you have a good eye for the game. That's obvious. But, I think Gordon Hayward, you said it best, mustache and all, was a huge comeback for this team. He's one of those guys, like you mentioned, I see similar to a Marcus Smart in that he's not the core contributor to that offense or defense, but it's the little things he does on the floor, whether it's create spacing or just take up space as a threat on offense, that really opens up the game for the Celtics. And you had the feeling that Boston would respond after 2 really tightly contested games in which, they did let things get away from them at the end. They're too talented. They're too well coached not to keep this series competitive. You have to wonder if that locker room spat after game 2 and subsequent team meetings sort of hit the metaphorical reset button on the Celtics in this series and sort of allowed them to respond with a really solid wire-to-wire victory in game 3. Aidan, I see this most recent victory in game 3 and the one they had in game 5 in that series against the Raptors as 2 games that had the weight and importance of a game 7. You figure if the Celtics lose either of those games, they'd be looking at a very different situation right now and maybe not even be in the playoffs.
Yeah, Rob, they are coming up big in these do-or-die games, and that's what it takes to succeed. And let me just say the NBA pulled a fast one. The Celtics played yesterday, Saturday, and now they don't play again until Wednesday, just because the league wanted the Western Conference Finals to catch up because it started a couple of days later. And to me, I feel like that works against the Boston Celtics in that they clearly are the team with more momentum, having won game 3. But if there's anything to be taken from that, it's that Gordon Hayward has an extra few days to rest. Obviously, he was playing not hurt, but obviously in some discomfort from his usual state. So we'll see how the Celtics can manage to respond after a 3 or 4 day layover between these games. But let's talk real quick just about the NHL, because it almost seems we're not doing it much justice holding it off till one of our last things here. But we have the Stanley Cup finals going on right now, and those Dallas Stars that we talked about, They won game 1 and they dominated, right? In a 4-1 victory, they really put together one of the best performances we have seen from them all postseason, and that's saying a lot. So what were your emotions watching that game, and what did you see out there?
Yeah, and I feel like our weekly NHL segments have just turned into what's going on with the Dallas Stars. I mean, I think they have captured the hearts of a lot of NHL fans across the country. They've really put on an unprecedented run against really, really good teams who, have been the favorite against the Stars in each of these series. They took care of the Avalanche. They were underdogs. They took care of the Golden Knights in 5 games. They were underdogs. They beat the Tampa Bay Lightning, heavily favored in game 1, 4-1. They're the underdogs. So I think this team's ability to respond to criticism and kind of daunting opponents is out the window. They are ready, and you talk about momentum in that Celtics series being such an important factor. If there was any team to embody the word momentum, it's the Stars. They've been red hot. Anton Hudobin, their goaltender, continues to be scorching between the pipes. He's at the forefront of this Stars run. He stopped 35 of 36 shots the other night. And our boy, Yoel Kiviranta, who we talked about a few episodes ago, he put one in the net in the third period to kind of cap off that Stars victory in style. So I love to see what they're doing. It'll be interesting to see how the Lightning respond. I think this is the first series in this postseason where they've sort of been on the back foot. There was a time in that Boston Bruins series where things were looking a little testy, but they responded very quickly. But, playing against a team that they really never saw anything of during the regular season, given that, they play in a different conference, I'm eager to see how the Lightning, a team who have sort of been up and ahead this entire run, come back against a Stars team that shows no signs of slowing down.
Yeah, and the Stars really, it's the convincing, even dominating fashion in which they've been able to make this playoff run. You talk about their last series, virtually anyone who said that the Stars had a shot of winning that, they were going to say it would take up to a game 7, right? And the fact that they were able to take care of business and just not look back once, really, you're right, they do epitomize the word momentum. And I think it's safe to say that this is sort of one of those anything can happen in the bubble sort of moments. You would not necessarily see the same kind of momentum carry in a regular NHL season, or at least it'd be a very different momentum. But let's not let that take away from anything the Stars are doing right now. If anything, it's just proving sometimes that the best team wins. And maybe we've been overlooking the Dallas Stars as the best team for quite some time now.
Yeah, they've really responded to the doubters in more ways than one. I think for the bubble and for a normal playoff format, the hottest team coming in has the best chance to win. You have a very condensed amount of time to prove that you're worthy of being a champion, and the Stars are leaving no doubt in that regard, as they sit just 3 games away from their first title since 1999. But enough about the NHL. We'll get to that next week. Hopefully our Stars, the team of the WCHC Sports Podcast for hockey, have lifted the Stanley Cup by then. Tell me about your assist of the week, Aidan, as we get into our final segment.
Yes, so assist of the week. And this is sort of an unorthodox one, but seeing as we are a podcast ourselves, I would like to give my assist of the week to NBA play-by-play commentator Mike Breen, as during last night's Celtics Heat game, he drew viewers' attention to the fact that Celtics rookies Grant Williams and Tacko Fall, they actually have their own podcast produced by the Anything is Potable from The Athletic. And just while I was taking a break from doing some homework today, I was like, okay, that's awesome. I'm going to give this a listen right now. And I only listened for, 7-8 minutes or so. I was pretty busy, but it is some good stuff. It's Grant, it's Tacko, and they talk about anything. Today I listened to Tacko Fall. I listened to him talk about how much he loves watching TV, and I listened to him insist that his TV was both bigger and nicer than his teammate Grant Williams. They also talked a little bit more on the serious side about Shaquille O'Neal and what his game would look like in today's NBA. But yeah, whether you want to hear the basketball talk or you want to hear about Tacko's TV watching habits, definitely check out the Grant and Tacko podcast, as it is grade A listening.
Yeah, you see a lot of athletes now with their own podcasts. I think Kevin Durant is probably one of the more famous examples. Draymond Green, Ian Happ of the Chicago Cubs has his own podcast. So it's nice to see athletes sort of getting more involved in these social media scenes, expressing their opinions, kind of showing that they're just like us in a way. And Aiden, if there's one hope that I have for this podcast moving forward, it's not being largely successful. It's getting Tacko Fall as a guest appearance on this show, because I think that would be a wonderful thing to see and a really great thing to be a part of.
You know, Rob, it has to happen. Tacko Fall. Honestly, I'm with you. I don't think that our podcast necessarily needs to even make too much of a splash in the world of podcasts. I think it's just about finding that connection, that taco connection, so to speak.
Yep, Tacko, if you're listening, give us a call. We'll be happy to have you on. But my assist is staying within the world of basketball. It's The Last Dance, the famed documentary about Michael Jordan and the '98 Chicago Bulls, winning an Emmy for Outstanding Documentary / Nonfiction Series. And, when I saw this news, I almost kind of forgot that I had watched The Last Dance. I think had to be 5-6 months ago as a Bulls fan, no less. But, it really brought me back to when that series premiered. And it was during a time when pretty much all the entire country was in lockdown, and we all really needed something to bring us together and talk about. And I think the screening of The Last Dance to so many basketball fans and even non-basketball fans, I had friends who didn't really watch the sport, talk to me about, how great the Bulls were and how iconic of a character Michael Jordan was. I viewed it as a cultural moment during the early stages of the pandemic that brought people together from all walks of life, mainly sports fans. But I was glad to see The Last Dance get the recognition it deserved. It was so well made. I got chills watching it, and I knew what was going to happen. Like, that's how good it was. So I'd like to hear your opinion on it, and hopefully you agree with me that, it really was a rare instance of a documentary in sports bringing such a large crowd in one place, each week.
Well, first, let me just say, I can't believe it was that long ago. It feels like it was literally a month and a half, 2 months ago that my nightly, or rather weekly routine was trying to rush through all of my homework I could Sunday night just so I could catch both episodes of The Last Dance. I remember that's what kept me going in terms of sports during the pandemic. And, obviously it's tough. It did capture the gaze of sports fans everywhere in a time when they needed it the most, but it really was the biggest story in sports, other than the fact that there were no sports, if that makes sense. So I totally agree with you. It was well done. And your point is well taken on, we knew exactly what was going to happen, right? It's not watching sports in a traditional sense. It's just talking about the human elements of all of those members of the 97-98 Bulls and all that went into putting that team together, as well as, unfortunately, their untimely, unfortunate demise at the hands of management. So, yeah, that's a great assist for this week. And definitely Last Dance, I might even give it a rewatch.
Yeah, it's rare that something ever replaces live sports or is able to, replicate the feeling of it. And I thought that The Last Dance did a pretty near perfect job of kind of filling our live sports cravings for at least, the 4 or 5 weeks that it was on.
Yeah. So speaking of dancing, that moves me on to my fumble for today. And that goes to the security at Fenway Park, home to the Boston Red Sox, as a fan wearing a Sox jersey appears to have bravely scaled the back of the Green Monster before standing on the catwalk, and he appears to have danced, yelled, done push-ups, and thrown objects onto the field. And it did create quite a disturbance because obviously the last thing on anybody's mind right now is the fans. There are none, right? You have cardboard cutouts, if anything. And obviously, I don't wish to make light of what was potentially a confusing or even serious situation. There have been conflicting reports as to whether the individual ended up in police custody or was undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. But it's a fumble nonetheless. The fact that he was wearing a Sox jersey, I think it reflects a little bit poorly on Boston as a city. But at the same time, it does show just how deeply the connection between the fans and the teams does run. So, positive, negative takeaways from it, but I'm going to put it down as a fumble.
Yeah, it certainly is a fumble. I think it does provide a little bit of a humorous outlet for Red Sox fans in particular, given that this season is one they'd like to forget. Boston sits at the bottom of the American League. But it reminds me of some of these other situations you see going on at other ballparks, namely Wrigley Field. I'm obviously a big follower of the Cubs. Last week, I remember seeing somebody fly a drone above the field during a Cubs game at night, and the game had to be postponed for 10, 15 minutes as the umpires and the stadium crew had to figure out where the drone was coming from and how they could get it out of the field of play. So, some funny moments here and there to distract us from everything else going on in the world. And that brings up my fumble, which takes us into the world of sports gambling. I don't know if this is a conflict of interest for legal reasons, given that we're doing this through Holy Cross, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. A college football bettor who still remains anonymous put $40,000 on the over for the Oklahoma State Tulane matchup this past Saturday. Oklahoma State at the time was the 11th ranked team in the nation, playing against a vastly inferior Tulane team. And the bettor predicted with his 40 grand that they'd combine for over 66 points. And the total ended up being 23. The Oklahoma State Cowboys only scored 17 points in their 17-6 victory. So not only did this guy lose $40,000, but he lost it badly, without any question. The line ended up being 43 points away from what it originally was. And, I think you just have to chalk that up to bad luck, regardless of what a poor financial decision that was. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I do try to stay away from sports betting just as much as I can, especially when it comes to, putting a spare 40K on a game. I usually don't do that. Anything can happen, but yeah, definitely it's not a good look. And I don't even know how I feel about the betting on college football thing either. Like, it's one thing if you're talking like pro athletes, like horse racing, I get it, but like college kids, like, there are arguments to be made, but come on.
Yeah, throwing around a spare $40,000 that you have lying around. I wouldn't advise anyone listening to this podcast to do the same.
So lastly, let's talk what to watch for this upcoming week in sports. There are a whole lot of things to choose from. Obviously, if I were going with my heart, I would go with Celtics Heat. But that said, we should keep an eye on this. The WNBA semifinal playoff series between the Seattle Storm and Minnesota Lynx, it was postponed today, just 90 minutes prior to Game 1 tipping off. And that was because of multiple inconclusive COVID tests conducted among the players. And it's certainly notable for the WNBA, as the playoffs were really starting to heat up. They had a successful regular season under the bubble format, but the fact that they employed that bubble format, it definitely makes you sort of wonder about the NHL, even though it's nearly wrapped up, the NBA, and just in terms of potential threats to sort of permeate that bubble. And all indications are that thankfully the Storm and Lynx should be able to play game one of their series Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, but definitely something in terms of monitoring this whole sports during the age of COVID situation that we definitely should keep an eye on.
Sure. And for my what to watch for, I'm going to take us back to the world of golf. I know it's been a few weeks since I've done that, but this past weekend we had Bryson DeChambeau win the U.S. Open by 6 shots in a tournament where no other player shot under par at Winged Foot Golf Club in New York. 21-year-old Matt Wolff was the leader at 5 under going into Sunday, but shot 5 over on the day, giving way for DeChambeau to shoot a cool 3 under and win his first major as professional. I think there's somewhat a bit of controversy around DeChambeau, given that a lot of the, old school, antiquated scholars, of golf don't really enjoy the way he plays. He takes a lot of time to strategically plan out his shots. He beefed up 35 pounds this past offseason to get 30, 40 more yards distance on his drives, a move that was highly criticized and that people thought he would lose a lot of finesse to his game. But it ended up paying off. He silenced the doubters, much like the Dallas Stars are doing right now. And DeChambeau gets his first U.S. Open at a course that was absolutely brutal all weekend in terms of the greens and how players were struggling just to make par. I think a lot of guys were happy to make bogey on most of these holes. You saw Justin Thomas, who was the leader after day one, shooting 5 under for the round, end of the tournament at 6 over. So, no lead was safe in this tournament, but Bryson DeChambeau was able to not only win, but win convincingly.
Yeah, that's a good one, Rob. And also, on the note of the U.S. Open, I want to give a quick shout out to my friend and 2020 Holy Cross alum, Jack Milko, who, as former president of WCHC Sports just last year and before, he actually took on, I believe it was a production role for the U.S. Open this year. So definitely he sort of had dibs on front row seats for the action, and yeah, worth giving him a shout out from our end.
Hats off to him.
So that about wraps things up for episode 8 of the WCHC Sports Podcast. Shout out to tennis, because Rob and I did not mention tennis at all like we did in weeks prior, but we're tired of talking, but we will be recharged and re-energized to talk all things sports same time next week.